Check Podcasts.
Welcome to the Rising Economy podcast, where leading thinkers, changemakers, and newsmakers discuss current issues and bold ideas impacting the economy and people of Greater Victoria.
Welcome to the Rising Economy podcast, brought to you by South Island Prosperity Partnership, Greater Victoria's economic development agency and the host of the annual Rising Economy Conference. I'm Carrie Slavens, and I'll be your host for today's Rising Economy episode, Why the Pay Gap for Women Still Persists. Before we get going, I just want to acknowledge that we're podcasting today from Czech Studios, located on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen people, today known as the Esquimalt and Songhees Nations. Well, this is very timely. I saw the Barbie movie on the weekend, and if I wasn't thinking about women and equity before, I'm certainly thinking about it now. I'm excited to introduce our two guests today. Climie and Sophie Warwick are co-founders of the Thoughtful Co. And we're going to talk about an issue that not only affects women in the workplace in Canada and around the world, it affects economies, it affects just about every aspect of society, I would say. I'd like to introduce our panelist. Climie is co-founder of the Thoughtful Co. Gillian has spent her career advising and leading teams in executive compensation and corporate governance, both as a consultant and in-house at two global retailers. At Lululemon, she led the global equity compensation and executive compensation programs. And then after taking a pause, she realized she wanted more of three things in her professional life: thoroughness, passion, and freedom. She co-founded the Thoughtful Co. to leverage her experience, coupled with her passion for gender equity, to empower women to get paid what they deserve. And we also have Sophie Warwick, who co-founded the Thoughtful Co. with Gillian. Sophie specializes in developing in-house gender equity policies and chairing employee resource groups and advocacy groups. She uses her data analysis expertise from her engineering background to define targets and track growth and retention. In 2018, she co-founded the nonprofit Women in Consulting Engineering to support and empower women in engineering. So welcome, and let's dive into it. Recent data from the Canadian Women's Foundation shows women working full-time earn 16.1% less than their male counterparts. That gap widens for racialized women, Indigenous women, women with disabilities. The Centre also revealed that if we don't make changes now, it will take 267.6 years, that's more than 2 centuries, to close the economic gender gap worldwide. And 1 in 5 women don't even believe that it will ever close, and who can blame them with numbers like that? So I'm going to start with you, Gillian. One of the things you do at the Thoughtful Co. is help women get paid what they deserve. And I want to ask you more about that in a moment. But first, what's going on out there? Can you start by giving us an overview on the current state of women's pay inequity in Canada? Where do we stand? What are the numbers telling us? What's happening?
Yeah, great place to start. So overall in Canada, women with full-time jobs earn about 84% of what their male counterparts earn. And I always like to bring up this stat as well from Untangle Money that found that for every dollar that a man has in net worth, a woman has only 32 cents. Wow. So that's pretty material. And although representation of women in the corporate world has increased, the gender pay gap has remained relatively stable over the past 15 years. And as you mentioned, that gap is larger for racialized women, women who are newcomers to Canada, women with disabilities, Indigenous women, and trans women. Mm-hmm. So some pretty big numbers there. And what those numbers are telling us from our perspective is kind of two main pieces. One is the organizational side. We're all biased, right? Everyone is biased. And when we start to think about compensating our teams, hiring our teams, promoting our teams, bias comes into all of those decisions. So unless we're actively course correcting those biases and helping us to make more equitable decisions, the gender pay gap will remain. And then on the individual side, just anecdotally throughout my career, I had seen not a lot of women negotiating their compensation. And even when they did, they asked for less than they could. And there's actually a term to describe this. It's called the ask gap. So women expect and ask for lower compensation than men do.
Wow.
So we're already kind of starting at this tougher point structurally within our organizations. And then also we're negotiating for less. So it's kind of a double whammy on both sides.
Incredible. And, we were just saying we're both at different stages of our career, and Sophie as well. I can't believe that when I started out in the workforce, I thought, oh, this is going to get solved. We were all gung-ho. And, almost 30 years later, it's still there. So maybe the gap is, narrowed slightly over that time, but it's still there, which is why we're talking about it today. And that brings us to the work of your organization, the Thoughtful Co. So Sophie, I'd like it if you could tell us about the Thoughtful Co. and your process for working with women to achieve the salaries they deserve.
Yeah, absolutely. So we support women in a variety of ways, from one-on-one coaching sessions to contract review to equity valuation to senior executive peer analysis. So a lot of different ways. One of the most common is that one-on-one coaching. And the way we run those sessions is we kind of break it into two parts. So the first part being we actually go through the different elements of the compensation package real time. So looking beyond base salary, beyond bonus, all of those other different elements. So vacation, tech allowances, and providing feedback from a market perspective of where that individual could push. So our perception of that, but also a really important piece is hearing what's important to them as well. Sometimes we work with clients who are really wanting to push on base salary or bonus, and other times we work with clients where the number one thing on their list is getting their parking allowance covered, because that really means they can show up to work powerfully. So hearing what's important to them as well. And then the second part of that session is helping to craft a script to negotiate with confidence, which sounds really funny. And it wasn't necessarily what we intended when we started, but being able to feel really confident about the structure of the ask is so important. And so we help to frame it in a concise way and also articulate that individual's unique skill sets and strengths, and then communicating that in a really positive manner. And what we find working with our clients, so often we get a deer in the headlights when we ask for, what are you delivering at work? And then all of a sudden we ask a couple of leading questions and we hear all of these incredible, wonderful things that this person is doing. But sometimes women do have some discomfort around self-promotion. And there was a study by Harvard Business Review that found that women are less likely to self-promote than men. And it tied primarily to a fear that if women were too self-focused, they might be disliked by their team members. So it is very common, but we like to leave our clients feeling really confident and empowered to go into those negotiations.
And that scripting is, really helpful because, I know as a young woman in the workforce, you could ask for a raise. Well, what happens if they say no? Oh, okay. Try again next year. So how to be proactive and yet appear positive and all of those things. I can see the value in that. So the next big question is, so you're doing this work with women to help them achieve this. Does it work? What's the proof that it works?
Yeah, great question. So on average, our clients receive more than 25% higher on average than their current compensation package. So a really meaningful number in terms of what they're asking for. And then another piece as well is so often we hear such wonderful feedback, but even before that individual has actually gone into the conversation, that they just feel more confident and excited to negotiate versus being filled with fear or really nervous about it. So that in itself is a really positive value too.
Wow, that's amazing. I saw a number in the Globe and Mail. They asked it on for International Women's Day, and it's based on a survey by, I believe it's a survey by Indeed, the jobs website, and they found that less than half 46% of Canadian women had ever asked for a raise in their salary. So let's get back to that. I'm kind of fascinated by that. The why. Why are we just trained that way? Are we just, does it just start early with us and we feel that, is it about likability? Is it like that we don't deserve it? Is it all kinds of reasons? What do you think about that, Jillian?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And it's so interesting. We work with, C-suite level executives who are managing multi-million-dollar budgets and massive teams. We also work with new college or university grads just out of school across Canada, the UK, and the US. And so many of them, regardless of location or level, say the same things to us. And that's often, I just felt like I was lucky to get the job, or I wanted to prove myself first before negotiating. And we will hear that same narrative truly from, so many different women. So it's clearly not about that specific role or about that specific woman. It's something societal that has been ingrained in us. And I think we really struggle with that. We feel lucky to be there often because we might not look like everyone around us, especially at a senior level, right? If you're a senior executive woman, depending on the industry, you might be the only one there.
Yeah.
So there's that automatic kind of feeling of being lucky, which we really need to push against, right? You add so much value. We talk to these women and hear about all the incredible things they do. They're often, way overqualified to even get the role. So we really try to support in that area. And I think another piece also is when you're negotiating, you're kind of isolated. You're on an island. You're often doing it alone. And whereas, the person you're negotiating with is typically in a power position, and it can feel really daunting, right? You don't know exactly what to ask for. At a more senior level, it gets complex with things like bonus structures, equity compensation. So we really try to fill that gap to provide the data and education and support and empowerment to help that, be a team member for that person going into the negotiation where it can be really isolating.
It's interesting. I think I learned about negotiation buying my first car, but here's what I learned. It was that take a man with you because you'll get a better price. So it wasn't somebody going, I'll come with you and help you learn to negotiate. It was take a man with you, you'll get a better price. That was one of the first messages I received about negotiating, was that I'm not going to get what I want no matter what I do there. Now, I know car dealerships are changing, and we're going back 2 decades, 3 decades, right? And thankfully that is changing. But that was, a key message. So I'm wondering, and Sophie, please, you jump in on this too, how we fix it. How do we ensure we're empowering women, but also not saddling them with fixing something that affects us all on some level? There's a Kate, I think it's McInturf is her last name, from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, wrote in a Maclean's article, quote, when it comes to the gender pay gap, women are told to be more assertive, choose higher paying jobs, or, as the head of Microsoft suggested, leave it to karma, unquote. How do we make sure we're not saying that the victims of this system have to do all the heavy lifting? Sophie, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I love just what you said there at the end, making sure that the victims of that experience aren't the people that are responsible for delivering all of that change. I think so often when we think of equity, diversity, and inclusion, it is often marginalized groups that are leading the charge. And so I think there's an element there where women can learn tools and resources to take ownership and control of their own situation. And I think may as well do those as well. We know that women are 30% more likely than men to receive feedback that they are intimidating or aggressive. So making sure to go into negotiations, really framing it positively, thinking about why you're in the room and remembering you're probably there because you're excited about this new job opportunity. You would like to continue growing with this company, whatever it is, expressing that up front. But on the other hand, I don't think it's women's responsibility to make that change. And I think we are taking strides in a positive direction. I mean, there is a lot of new pay legislation that's coming up in BC specifically as of November, but also we're seeing it in states in the US, and I'm sure we'll see more following suit. And as well, a lot more companies taking on their own ownership to look at their structures and think about how they could introduce more standardization so that they can make equitable pay decisions. So I do think there's absolutely an element where don't necessarily wait for all of that positive change. I think use the tools in your toolbox to make the change for yourself too. But I don't think all of that heavy lifting should be on women.
Okay, that's really interesting. Do you have anything to add to that, Jillian? Or
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that's why we, our two main focuses at the Thoughtful Co. are one, supporting individual women, but also supporting employers and companies to make that structural change. And we've realized, with an individual woman client, we can get her an extra $25K tomorrow. With the companies we're working with, it's more longer term. We're setting up structural change within their recruiting processes, hiring, promotion, compensation, all these different structures to make longer term change, but it doesn't happen tomorrow. So we feel really, it's important to kind of support from both sides so we can have that impact as soon as possible.
And I imagine, it makes a difference whether you're talking, what industries you're talking to as well. And I mean, there are some industries where women are consistently paid minimum wage. There are some where women are able to, as we say, climb the corporate ladder. And, I think it's important, and I'm sure both of you would agree, that we have to acknowledge that some industries, some employers, it's less movable than others at this stage. So how do we support the women who are in industries that are more resistant to change, to make sure that we're all rising?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's a really interesting point because we actually specialize in supporting companies in male-dominated industries. Yeah. So industries like engineering firms, construction firms, tech, mining, some of these industries where it has been traditionally harder to make change. And that's really due to Sophie's experience. She's a structural engineer by trade and has spent her career off the side of her desk, helping implement this change, started a nonprofit around it, and now we're able to get into companies to support. But I think she has that additional lens, and I'll let her speak for herself. The additional lens to kind of understand those industries after working in them.
Okay, and actually, Sophie, maybe that's a good segue. Do you want to talk about, some of the less, industries where women have been less inclined to work or been less inclined to try to enter into that work historically?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, engineering is such a great example. We've seen academically slow growth, but much higher growth. And when we look in Canada, engineers in 1990 was hovering around 13%, both academically and in the profession. And then fast forward, almost 35 years, and academically it is much higher. It's at about 30%, but within the profession, it's pretty close to 13% still. So not a lot of growth. So it's an interesting challenge where I think we are at an early education level, making a lot of positive strides to think about the way we present different job opportunities and career plans to young children. So they're not necessarily developing those same gendered perceptions as early. I mean, obviously it still happens, but I think we're making positive change. The challenge is sometimes that retention within the industry. And I'm using the example of engineering, but I think it's applicable in so many male-dominated industries where anytime you have uniformity, and it's not about it being men or it being women or it being any gender, it's just about uniformity. It is so hard to break in because we all tend to hire and promote people that are similar to us. And so if leadership is similar, then we continue to see that. And I have been a victim of that myself, being a mentor to two women at the same time, one of which was so like me. And I reflect on it now, and I gave her a lot more headspace than the woman who was equally amazing, has also gone on to have a wonderful career. But we just had less in common in terms of our hobbies and interests. And so I think we're at a point where a lot of employers, though, are aware that they want to do something. Some are already working on that. But at least I think in most cases, at the very least, employers are asking the right questions now.
And right now, coming through the pandemic, coming out of the pandemic, there's a huge issue with hiring and retaining employees. It's near the top of employers' lists for the things that they keeps them awake at night. And certainly in the surveys we've done at South Island Prosperity, it comes up. So actually, in order to expand the pool for hiring and increase chances for retention, why not women?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any thoughts about that, Jillian?
Yeah, I think it's interesting thinking about the new generations that are coming into the workforce and what they're wanting. We've looked into this a lot, just, out of interest in helping our clients to gain that broader understanding. New generations are looking for pay equity. Mm-hmm. They're looking for real diversity, equity, and inclusion, and they're looking for impact. And those things are, not just nice to haves now. Yeah. They're things that new generations are demanding. So working on, DE&I, pay equity, all these things that we're talking about is the right thing to do, and companies should be doing it anyway. Mm-hmm. But there's also such a strong financial business case in terms of hiring employees and the financial outcomes. One of our favorite stats to reference, which I think just sums up so much of the different research that's out there, is from McKinsey and Lean In, who do a study each year on women in the workplace. And their most recent one found that company profits and share price can be almost 50% higher when women are well represented at the top.
Wow.
So, and there's so much around creativity, innovation, sustainability, long-term longevity within all this research. So it's such a great time for us to be doing what we're doing because we love it, we're passionate about it, mm-hmm. but there's also a really strong business case for hiring talent and mm-hmm. for financial performance of companies.
And I think that is absolutely critical for employers, to look in that direction. I mean, because our entire economy right now, it's we need that. We need that fluidity of being able to, hire broadly, and keeping employees is, what is it? It's far less expensive to keep your employees than yes. to have high turnover. So yeah. Another business case. This question's for both of you. I want to look for a minute. You touched on it. We've touched a little bit on where this starts, and young girls even. But let's look at how the lack of pay equity, the gap, affects women throughout their careers and even into retirement. How does this gap contribute to economic disparities and long-term financial insecurities? What impact is it having broadly across women's lifespans? And Sophie, do you want to take that or?
Yeah, I think it starts, so early. And I think a common challenge is, we hear this, as we said earlier, at all levels of the career, but starting out at your, maybe your first corporate job or your first job out of school or whatever it might be, there's such a strong sense of thank you for having me, or I will wait to get enrolled to negotiate. And because compensation decisions are made as percentage decisions, often from a corporate perspective, that can really impact your long-term wealth over your full career. And so sometimes it can be easy to dismiss negotiating for $1,000 because, across amortized over a year, how much is that? But over a full career, and you think about those percentage increases, your opportunity for savings, how that impacts your RSP matching program, if that's something that's available, or your ability to benefit from compound interest of early savings. All of those things yep. impact wealth so directly. And so sometimes we talk so much about salary and compensation because that is the heart of it, but it impacts all of these other things that have this added on wealth impact. And I think so much of it is socialization and the systemic barriers that exist within the corporate world. Mm-hmm. And so I think in general, most employers want to pay their people properly, but the reality is, because the structure is set up often that you have to make noise to negotiate. Sometimes that means negotiating out of your typical performance review structure and that cadence, and that typically women are socialized that is less acceptable to do. So mm-hmm. men will more often get those opportunities. And so looking at all of these opportunities to introduce standardization to help prevent that happening.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
Jillian, anything to add?
One of my favorite stats that we share with most of our clients is studies have found that a difference of $1,000 in your starting salary can mean a cumulative loss of over $500,000 in your career. And that is a bit of an older study now. It's probably more. And depending on the industry you're in, if you're in a more specialized role, it could be a lot higher than that. So it's just a good reminder, it's always worth it to negotiate even for a little bit more because of those percentage increases, as Soph mentioned.
Yep.
And employers need to get pay equity right at the start because that gap just gets bigger and bigger over time.
Right.
Because annual performance percentage increases, promotion percentage increases. If you're starting too low, you're never going to make that up.
Yeah.
So that's something we're very passionate about. And another interesting stat is there's also a gender pension gap in Canada that has not narrowed over time. It was about 15% in 1976, and it's 18% in 2020.
Wow.
So just another kind of interesting data point that things, we are, I think, structurally moving in the right direction, but we're still seeing not a lot of movement in some of these big gaps, the wealth gap, the pay gap, and the pension gap.
Exactly. And, I was just thinking $500,000, well, for a lot of people, that's a retirement.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's putting pressure on other aspects of society as well when that's lacking. I want to, just divert for a minute here, or maybe it's not a diversion. What about the pandemic? What impact did that have on pay equity for women, if any? I've heard that actually women were able to come back and ask for more, but the gap was still there. Any stats or knowledge about this from either of you?
Yeah, I feel like there was a lot going on during the pandemic, so a lot of different things. One stat that is really powerful that we like to share is over 20,000 Canadian women left the workforce between February and November 2020, and over 2/3 of those women were mothers of children under 6.
Interesting, right?
So there was
Not
definitely, a lot of, burnout and sometimes leaving the workforce entirely for these additional home responsibilities that were often disproportionately put on women. That being said, there have been some positive aspects of the pandemic as well. Work from home in some cases has been beneficial for women and new mothers. There's been also, I would say, a broader acknowledgement coming out of the pandemic because, some of these stats are worse, but at least there's an acknowledgement that these issues are still here and we still need to be working on them. So that was really a positive for me. Reading these stats is obviously not great, but it's nice that we're seeing the headlines out there and people are bringing up this issue again. And another key piece is some of the biases that women do face in the workplace. Like we talked about the similarity bias, the likability bias. The pandemic did exacerbate some of these. When you're making decisions on who you need to terminate, it's more likely to fall on those people who face bias. So so there was some positives and some negatives. So I don't know if you have anything else to add on that.
Yeah, Sophie?
Yeah, the only thing I would add, I think that was all like fantastic, and I think it does really stress those caregiving demands. The only thing I would add is I think as we navigate this new workforce where remote or hybrid is often part of the package or part of the expectation, I think in a perfect world, although not applicable to all industries and roles, I think the hybrid model is amazing. It gives people the opportunity to make work for their lives as well. However, I think the only challenge is setting clear expectations, which I don't always see. So, maybe it's a hybrid model where people can just pick to do whatever they want. However, those key decision makers happen to be the ones that go into the office. And if they're not necessarily aware of, standard promotional practices or hiring practices, they might just be promoting the people they see every day.
Yeah.
And if we know that disproportionately women do take on more caregiving duties in Canada, then it's going to continue to skew towards men. So if it is a hybrid model, making sure to implement those structures to standardize that promoting or setting really clear expectations that everyone comes in on Wednesdays or whatever it is. So everyone gets that clear message of this is when we come in.
That's a great point. And I'm wondering first of all, how does Canada rank in terms of pay equity for women? Do either of you know how we rank worldwide?
I mean, that's interesting. We were just looking into Canada specifically a few months ago. There was new data released, and actually BC and Alberta, I believe, have the worst pay equity in Canada, which is interesting. I wouldn't have necessarily thought that, but then you think about some of the industries there, and it starts to make sense. Canada seems to be pretty in line with the U.S. I mean, there's so many within the pay gap in general, and I have spent my career in compensation, so I always think about, how would you determine compensation? Are you thinking about a full-time worker, all the different kind of criteria for it? Canada and the US are pretty similar at around the 84%, which seems to be also kind of similar for the UK. So it seems these countries that are operating in similar ways with similar attitudes toward the corporate world and how we run our organizations and companies have those same structural issues, that there's kind of this barrier that we're not able to move past. And so our hope, with our work is to make that structural change slowly over time. And we do believe helping male-dominated industries can be such a powerful way to support the full economy in that.
Right.
I come from companies like Lululemon who have so many incredible women leaders at the top. I've been fortunate enough to work with incredible women leaders throughout my whole career and see the amazing things that they do, and supporting industries that are maybe not quite there yet to really help reach that is what we're really passionate about.
Right. Okay. So that's really interesting. And when you look at the rankings, are there countries out there that are kind of superstars for this, where either government and the corporate world, or maybe both working collaboratively, where women have really excelled in terms of pay equity? Is there any honorable mentions here that we really need to point to that are doing well?
I can't actually think of any. Which is, I do think about New Zealand in terms of some of the policies and structures they have there around parental leave, pay equity legislation. I don't know the data on how that's actually, turned out within the wage gap. I think. And that's the part so much of this work. It will take years to see. Yeah. But I do think New Zealand, in my mind, is kind of a leader in that space of looking at, things like parental leave, making sure men have equitable access to parental leave, and even the Prime Minister. Yeah. We saw her exhibit all those qualities. So that's something that comes to mind for me. So I don't know if you can think of other really good examples. That's kind of depressing. But
I don't want to put you on the spot. Yeah.
I would love to say there's some great gold standards, but I don't necessarily think we're there yet. I do think there are some, great, especially Nordic countries with better parental leave policies. And I think all of those things have that compounding effect. Not to harp too much on parental leave, because, you think about it just as this one moment of your life, but it has that carry-on effect of associating certain genders or certain types of parents, so often birth mothers, with their family expectations. And so we know that 76% of people of all genders tend to more readily associate women with family and men with career. And so how that carries out, whereas if the expectation is that people, regardless of their gender, regardless of the way they're growing their family, whether it birth parent, adoption, surrogacy, whatever it is, are having that equitable access, then I do think that will have a strong impact on that gender pay gap.
Okay. Any last thoughts from either of you on, just where we're going and what we need to keep pushing on, what needs to happen in the year coming up? What do you want to see happen that's going to move the needle on this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it can be daunting sometimes. You started this off with the number of that it'll take, I think it's 267 years to close the pay gap. And it's frustrating to read that and hear that. But I think we have to keep talking about it, keep it front of mind. I think movies like Barbie are continuing that conversation, right? As crazy as it sounds.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Sometimes we can we can feel like we're in a really good place, but then when we look into it deeper, we realize with the stats, the numbers, we still need structural change.
Yep.
So I think keeping the conversation going, and our philosophy really is supporting each individual woman to get paid what she deserves will help to shift that power imbalance that we're having.
Right.
Each person matters. And then within companies, every time we get to support a company and help them become a little more equitable in their practices and get on that journey, it does have really big knock-on effects. So I think it can be daunting, but when you think about it more on that individual and company level, it's really amazing to see the positive impact that you can have. And we like to take a positive approach. So many companies that we work with in really male-dominated industries are so interested in this work. So it's really positive to hear that from, it's not a conversation shut down, which maybe 10 or 15 years ago it was.
Exactly. And I mean, it's good for women, good for families, good for kids, good for men, good for employers, good for the economy. I mean, there's so much to like. Sophie, anything to add?
Yeah, I love what you said. It's good for everybody. And I think there's just so much evidence that, investing in equitable, diverse, and inclusive policies benefits engagement of all employees, regardless of gender. And I think, to echo what Jill said, we work with all these wonderful clients who, thinking about working in construction and engineering and tech and these more male-dominated industries, sometimes we don't associate it, but we work with these wonderful people that are really excited to be working on this journey. And that's really wonderful to see. So I think we're taking really positive strides. And I'm also really excited at a local level to start hearing what happens after the first wave of the gender pay legislation in November for the larger companies, and seeing that knock-on effect, because in other jurisdictions, we've seen those be super impactful. So I'm excited to see how that impacts BC.
Can you just talk about that a little bit, about this legislation? What can we expect? What's happening?
Yeah, so as of November 1st of this year, it's the first wave. So it's just the larger companies, and the smaller companies have a couple more years to start adopting those
practices. Is this
practices.
Federal legislation or BC?
This is BC specifically.
Yeah, okay.
I believe, is it Nova Scotia also has gender pay legislation in place, and I assume that more provinces will follow as well. So all publicly posted jobs will have to show a pay range, which is great. So setting those expectations, and then also, requiring companies, if they don't have them in place already, to define those pay bands as well, which leads to more equitable decisions. And then also creating gender pay reports each year. So again, starting to look at that data and look at, are we happy with the pay decisions within our organizations? It's really exciting to see. I know California's already done that already, so has New York State, and it's exciting to see that movement.
Okay, that's fascinating. And I just want to bring it back to the 2 centuries to close the pay gap. The key phrase in there is, if we do nothing. So we have time to course correct on that. Well, I really want to thank Jillian Climie and Sophie Warwick of the Thoughtful Co. for being here today. How can people find out more about you?
Yeah, our website is www.thethoughtfulco.net. We're also on Instagram at thethoughtful.co and LinkedIn, The Thoughtful Co. And always feel free to add us on LinkedIn too if you want to chat about pay equity, compensation, diversity. We're very
that's awesome.
We're very open to it.
And thank you to our listeners. You can tune in to the Rising Economy podcast on CHEC's podcast network or anywhere you turn into your favorite podcasts, including Spotify. Finally, our Rising Economy podcasts are our way of keeping important conversations about our economy going all year, leading up to our 4th annual Rising Economy Conference from March 6 to 8, 2024 in Victoria and virtually. Find out more at ourrisingeconomy.ca. Thank you both for being here. Goodbye.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
This podcast is brought to you by South Island Prosperity Partnership. Learn more at southislandprosperity.ca.